Koto katoa. Welcome to Te Whare Waranga o Waikato, the University of Waikato, and thanks for coming out on this rainy night. I've got a few housekeeping matters to deal with just before I introduce Al. Cell phones, please check your cell phones and make sure they're on silent. Bathrooms, if you need to use the bathroom, they're across from the bar. And if there's an emergency, the ushers will instruct us what to do. My name's Wayne Rumbles. I'm the Acting Dean of Te Paringa Faculty of Law, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Al Gillespie. Al graduated from Auckland University Faculty of Law with an LLB and a Masters of Law, and he went on to complete a doctorate at Nottingham University. Al joined Te Paringa Faculty of Law here at Waikato in 1995 as an academic, where he got to teach some excellent students, including myself. And he currently holds a position as Pro Vice-Chancellor Research. Al was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship in 1998, taken at the Law School of Columbia in New York, and the Rockefeller Fellowship in 2001 in Italy, and the New Zealand Law Foundation International Research Fellowship in 2004. Al is often sought after by the media for expert comment in his areas of expertise. More recently, Al has made numerous TV and national radio appearances speaking on the war in the Middle East and ISIS. Al is internationally published and specialises in international and domestic environmental law and policy, and has written extensively in the areas of climate change, biodiversity and cetacean conservation. As students, we used to call him the whale man. More recently, Al has turned his research focus on armed conflict and the legal frameworks which surround or should surround such conflicts, as well as its geopolitical context. Arising from this research focus has been a 3-volume work entitled History of the Laws of War, which traces the origins of the modern law of warfare from the earliest times to present day. And he has published the first of a 4-volume series titled The Causes of War. The second will be out at the end of the year. And as he's pretty much of a multitasker, he's also a keen surfer. It gives me great pleasure to welcome out Professor Al Gillespie to address us on his insights on why or why not New Zealand should be involved in the fight against ISIS. I am sure Al's talk will generate lots of questions and comments, and there will be time at the end of the talk, so please hold your questions until after the talk. Because we are streaming live on YouTube, answering questions, you will need to use the microphone. So at the end, if you put up your hand, we'll make sure the microphone comes to you. So without any further ado, and bring on Al. Al.
Kia ora. Good evening. It's really good to see so many of you here tonight. It's a wet night, and it's hard to get out of home when it's this bad as it is, but to see this many people tonight is encouraging. I gave this lecture last week in Tauranga, and we had a similar sized audience, and it's indicative of how much the population and how much people are actually caring about this issue. And it's an important issue because it's unlike anything we've had to do for a long time, that decision of whether we should go to war. Now, my talk tonight is going to be for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have questions afterwards. I do not intend it to be polemical. With a lot of things I do, I don't try to come out on left or right. So those who are going to behead me for going for war, or those who are going to behead me for not going for war, will be disappointed. But there will be a third cue for my indecision, which will be over there towards halfway time. This topic, Islamic State, it's a difficult topic. We weren't meant to be here. A lot of, I've known Wayne for decades now, and some of you closer to my age, and you remember the Cold War, and you remember those days when the Cold War ended, just that euphoria that we were going to live happily ever after, and like the Soviet Union disappeared, and Bill Clinton came to town, and it was a days of excitement and happiness. And then we kind of went through a few bumps at the end of the 1990s, and then we got into the new century, And then we had the Arab Spring, and it was meant to be a time when democracy and freedom and open markets were going to go global. And so all of those terrible people that we'd seen in the 1980s, and actually going back earlier to the 1920s, dynasties, strongmen, families based purely around power, we thought they were all going to go away. We thought it would be like Pac-Man going through the Middle East, and we saw Gaddafi disappear. We saw Hussein disappear. We saw Assad get challenged, or Sadat. And the idea was that we were all going to live happily ever after, because the Cold War was over, the Arab Spring was going to come into the full summer, but it hasn't ended up like that. So something went wrong along the way. And so now you get to the point where you wake up in the morning, or you watch the news at night, and you get confronted with this bewildering collection of acronyms and foreign names, and we've almost become immune. I do a lot of media, and when the first terror attacks were starting, and from 2006, you'd have one busload of 40 people get machine gunned. It would be just everywhere, and it would be the topic for the week. Last night, 40 Shia got machine gunned in Pakistan, and it gets one little byline. And we've become immune to atrocity, and it's every day. And so these are just what we've got on the one side. So Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. These are the things to note about this current collection is they're all radical Sunni, so they're one side of the Muslim faith. They basically divide into two parts. And at the moment there's a rough cooperation going on between them, but there is a turf war between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Boko Haram sides with Islamic State, Al-Shabaab sides with Al-Qaeda. The difference between them is Al-Qaeda tries to set itself up as like the gold standard of terrorism. I'm not making that up, it's like they have more standards. Al-Qaeda was responsible for the Twin Towers, the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris. They're more refined, more disciplined. Islamic State is more street. They're rougher, they're without the refinement. They're not so based around Arab culture. They're broader. They like to see themselves as more cosmopolitan, more appealing to a wider class. And they're different to the others. Our Islamic State, which is the one I'm going to mainly talk about because that's the one that New Zealand's is involved in a war with now, is different to Al-Qaeda primarily because through al-Baghdadi they are seeking a caliphate, which is effectively where one man is the political and religious leader of the entire Muslim community. Now, caliphates aren't new in history. There's been a succession of them, but this current caliphate, which is being called for, is the first one for a number of centuries to be coming through. So that is new and that is different. And here we are. And so we're watching this war from afar, like we do as New Zealanders, safely at the bottom of the South Pacific, our little corner. And all of a sudden you become aware that things are changing, and you pick up your Time magazines and you pick up your Economist, and you can see this threat growing. Something's big. And then the Iraqi foreign minister decided to fly all the way from Iraq down to Australia and to New Zealand, bypassing all the Muslim countries on the way like Indonesia or Malaysia, and coming direct to us and asked us for help. And we've ended up being part of the coalition, which you can see on the picture in the bottom left-hand corner. And it's a broad-based coalition. It's largely Western. It's largely based around the United States, France, Britain, obviously, parts of Scandinavia, our good friend Australia, and a few Sunni-based countries in the Middle East. And so the request was made for us to contribute, and after much consideration, John Key decided to provide 142 soldiers to train the Iraqi army. I should explain now that my view is, if you're training the army, you're in the war. It's a false division to say that we're only training the guys who do the fighting. We are now engaged in a war with Islamic State, but we've got the minimum commitment compared to what our neighbours are doing and the other countries. And the other countries, I'll talk about it later, but they're upping their ante in terms of the geographical space that they're in, purely from the West, so to speak, like Europe, but they're mainly the main foreign volunteers who are not from Syria or from Iraq are coming from Turkey. They're coming from Tunisia, and they're coming from Egypt. The difficulty with the foreign fighters number is it's a guesstimate, but the bigger number that we don't talk about is how many fighters are on the ground. And so if you ask the Kurdish fighters who are fighting in the front line right now, they're going to tell you Islamic State is at least 200,000 people. And so to focus on the foreign fighters is one thing, but the reason there are so many domestic fighters is twofold. One, the pool of fighters who have exactly the same religious ideology, potential coming through from Saudi Arabia is up to 4 million. And even within the countries that are occupied, like within Iraq, you go into a city like Mosul, which is already a Sunni-based city, there's 1.8 million people there. There's unemployment in excess of 50%, and the Islamic State is now paying a rate for their soldiers which is greater than the Iraqi army. And so there's no shortage of volunteers, and so the numbers are very large. The battleground, where our soldiers are going into, it's important to realise that the war in Iraq is also the war in Syria. Although there's a line being divided between them at the moment, they are essentially exactly the same conflict. To put this into some kind of context, since World War II, your two biggest conflicts where there's been over 1 million dead in the conflict were the Vietnam War and then the Afghanistan War between the Soviet Union and the Mujahideen in the 1980s. Post those two wars, this is the biggest war we have seen since the end of the Cold War. So if you went into the Balkans with the former Yugoslavia, about 140,000 dead. If you go into Afghanistan with America post-2001, about 30,000 dead. Sudan, 200,000 dead. What's going on in Syria is unprecedented since the end of the Cold War. At least 250,000 dead now, and 4 million plus refugees. Now, just over the border, you have Iraq. Now, the Iraq War is pretty difficult to say when did it actually start and when did it finish. The thing with an Iraqi soldier or a potential soldier right now in Islamic State, if they are my age, there's a very good chance they fought in the Iraq-Iran War in the 1980s. They fought against America in 1991 with the invasion of Kuwait. They fought in the 2003 uprising against the American invasion then, and they're continuing to fight now. And so the Iraqi soldier, it's not just the young guys who look really fantastic and kind of scary and kind of weird as well that you see with Islamic State. It's the established soldier as well behind them. And so these are very seasoned fighters. These are not young or novice. The death toll you can see for Iraq going since 2003 with the American invasion is probably about 130,000 plus 2 million plus refugees. Now, so you're within those two countries, you're getting close to nearly 400,000 dead in the space of a couple of years. And on top of that, you've got 6 million plus refugees. And this is why, it's another topic altogether, but we are facing a refugee crisis at the moment, unlike anything we have seen since the Second World War. There are more refugees than at any point since 1945. And refugees tend to go in, they're growing anyway because of economic considerations and environmental considerations, but with war, you always see kind of a splurge. Like when you had the Vietnam War, you had the boat people. And you're seeing it now. And so if you want to actually stop all these people who are drowning in the Mediterranean, and you're looking at thousands of people now, it's remarkable. You've got to stop the war in Iraq, you've got to stop the war in Syria, you've got to stop the war in Libya, because otherwise this problem will continue to grow in itself. So now, the first part of my argument, why should we be involved? And so it's the first reason you want to be involved is that the Caliphate has goals of conquest which are regional, if not international. And so what they're intending, they work on a principle of what was once Islamic land, and this is at the height of the Muslim empire, so to speak, although it was always broken up into different sultanates and parts, is at the end of the 9th century and then going through. So they're intending to reclaim, obviously you can see Spain, you can see Hungary, you can see Greece, not to mention most of Africa down to the tropical belt, and a larger part of going through Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, all the way through to India. It's huge. So their goals are not about let's just get Syria or let's get Iraq. Their goals are very big. Second reason. James Foley, David Haynes, Stephen Sotloff, Alan Henning, Kenji Goto, Kyla Mueller. We've all seen it. We've all seen this one particular act designed to shock us into responding differently. So your reason here for why you want to get involved is that international law and humanity over a period of thousands of years has created laws of war. We all broadly know now what you can and cannot do in a conflict. Most of us can muddle our way through it. The point with Islamic State is that they don't care. All of the rules of war are just been put in the bin because Islamic State is working by rules that come from their interpretation of the Quran, and they have no respect for the Geneva Conventions or any of the Hague Protocols or anything. So this means that crimes against humanity, your first reason, they don't respect humanity. This is just the execution. This is not talking about the extreme problem of rape in the occupied territories. But your second reason, your second crime against humanity, genocide. We know that the way that traditional groups within this paradigm work is that if you are not a person of the book, and the person of the book is either you are Christian or you are Jewish, then if you are not a person of the book, you have no standing whatsoever. You are effectively almost a pagan, and the obligation is to carry out war to the utmost extreme against pagans. And so this means that for certain people like the Yazidi, the intention is to destroy in full or in part that ethnic group. And they're either doing it intentionally, or they'll do it through recklessness, or they'll do it through negligence by pushing them out into the desert. And so we see crimes of genocide. We know that they don't take prisoners. So like in any other conflict, if you are a soldier and you surrender, you have a whole series of rights that go back hundreds of years that you are allowed to be kept alive. We know that Islamic State don't take prisoners. Whether they're military prisoners of a different ethnic group, a different religious group, or here you can see the pilot who was from Jordan, who was, from Emirates, who was burnt alive. Jordan, I apologise, yeah, it was from Jordan. And again, the same principle though, that none of the prisoners have any rights. We see it with the cultural destruction. And again, we see, this is not unique to destroy someone else's culture. It's, we saw it again with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the Buddhas. You often see it in periods of revolution where people destroy other people's culture, but again you're seeing here not just the destruction of opposing Shia mosques, you're also seeing the destruction of traditional cultures outside of and previous to Islam and even Christianity. And then the final reason that we need to be thinking about this is that even if you are not interested in all this war and you want to close your eyes and say, I want it all just to go away, it won't. Because as much as you aren't interested in them, I can assure you they are interested in you. So you might be having your coffee in Sydney, or you might be driving your car in Britain, you might be going to a very controversial art show in Texas, or you might be publishing a magazine in Paris. And so the terrorism is coming towards us. And so even if we don't want to be interested in them, they are interested in changing the way that we live. So, those to me are very good arguments. Those are, you've got a group which is going to be regional, if not global, in its aspirations. There is no crime of war or crime against humanity that they have not committed, and they're at the forefront of terrorism. Those are good reasons to get involved. These now are the arguments of why not to be involved. Take a step back. Who are you defending? In World War I, we got involved in the conflict because we went originally to defend Belgium, and we knew what Belgium was. In World War II, we got involved because we went to defend Poland, and we knew that the values of what Poland was meant to do. And so, but when you get involved in a country like Iraq, look at its human rights record. Its human rights record is atrocious. Look at the problem it has with corruption, and then look at all of the factors that actually gave rise to the Islamic State in the first place. The sectarian politics and the policies that they had to make sure that certain people were excluded from government and from power. In many ways, when you look at the Iraqi army, this was one of the best armies ever made post-2004. The Americans spent $25 billion rebuilding the Iraqi army. It did not run away for lack of men, it did not run away for lack of weapons, it ran away for lack of identity and lack of spirit. And so you have to think, are we willing to defend this country which has so many problems? Are these the values that we aspire to? Second reason you don't want to be involved in this. If this war is as serious as you're saying, Al, this should be at the UN. We think of all the recent wars like we can think about that we've been involved in. We've been involved in Kuwait, we've been involved in East Timor, Afghanistan, and the Sudan, and the Security Council says this is a threat to international peace and security. Put on the blue helmets, use force, whereby all of the soldiers go forward under the international flag of the United Nations. And at the moment, this is not a UN war, this is a bilateral war. This is a war like Vietnam, where we're pulled in by old alliances, or this is a war like Afghanistan for the Soviets. This is a traditional war because the international machinery is broken. The Security Council is not working at the moment because of another conflict going on with Putin. And the difficulty here is that because Putin has got another conflict, and we have a conflict in the Ukraine, and there's already economic sanctions going over this, which may be renewed, and the Ukraine sits on a very fragile balance, it means that whenever we try to progress this at the Security Council and say this is an international threat to all people, the veto will go up. Because they've got no intention of letting this be an international solution. Because if you're trying to exploit or hurt the West, this is one of the best ways you can do it. You can let this problem continue to bleed. And you must remember also that Putin is personally responsible for the protection of Assad in Syria, and for a very strong economic and military support for Iran as well. And so Putin and Russia has defence alliances and responsibilities, which mean that they will not allow the international community to get involved. Why else don't you want to be involved? This is a war of proxies. We might want to dress this up as Islamic State, and we might want to dress this up as the defence of a country which has had its borders invaded or has been internally destroyed. But in many ways, what's going on right now is that this is Saudi Arabia, and this is Qatar, and this is Turkey on one side, and this is Iran on the other. And we are seeing that in many ways that these two parts, and so even though we are getting involved in fighting Islamic State, the contribution of Saudi Arabia, the contribution of Qatar, and the contribution of Turkey is that big. It's tiny. And they're busy very much on the sides doing other things. And we're beginning to see that conflict now breaking out in Yemen. And so why don't you want to be involved? Because this isn't, you could argue, our fight. This is a fight which has much deeper roots between these two. Why not be involved? We don't know what peace looks like. We've got no idea. A lot of people are going to say, look, let's get involved in this conflict. We've got to do it. These are terrible people. But what are you going to do about Syria? We know what we're going to do about Iraq. We've kind of got an idea that you want to rebalance it. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we rebalance it. What do you do with Syria? You've got 250,000 people plus. You've got a stalemate in the war. You've got 4 different sides. Are you going to divide the country? Are you going to insist Assad goes out? Are you going to support the rebel alliance? The ones that, not the ones out of Star Wars, but the ones that Obama is currently supporting? Who do we do it? We're not sure. And then when we start to think about even deeper questions, not just with regard to Syria, but what does the Middle East look like? You know, the Middle East that we've got at the moment is largely a creation of the League of Nations in 1919, and then subsequent treaties in the 1930s, where we drew lines over what became Iraq, what became Saudi, what became Syria, what became Israel. Do we need to rethink? Do you want an independent Kurdistan? Do you want to move one population to another area? I'm not saying here what the answer is, but we need to know what peace looks like. We need a bigger objective than just saying we're fighting Islamic State. And people need to be tuning their minds to, do you want an independent Kurdistan? But we're not asking those questions right now. We're just thinking, let's get involved in the fight. And here's your last reason why you don't want to be involved. This is just the beginning. If our professed enemy is Islamic State, we now know that it's like the game that you used to be able to play, whack-a-mole. Do you remember whack-a-mole? And you had this club, and you'd hit this little thing, this machine, and one would go down, and another mole would come up elsewhere, and you'd hit that, and then 2 would come up. And when you hit it again, and someone would come elsewhere. Islamic State is now moving around. And so if our professed enemy is in Iraq, what are you going to do when they appear as they are now in Yemen? What are you going to do when they appear in Egypt? What are you going to do when they appear in Libya? Those two in particular, just think about, Libya is now pretty close to being a failed state. And as much as we're pretty certain that in 2003, the forces that you're now fighting with Islamic State were largely the rebels who fought against the Americans in 2003. If they get beaten, they move, they go back into the communities, or they go to another country. And so if we want to be thinking about fighting the Islamic State, is the next stop for the New Zealand soldiers in Libya? Is the next stop in Yemen? Islamic State has said that its preferred target is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is a monarchy, and it's a very fragile monarchy. What happens when they get their teeth into that place? Do we go there as well? So what is the limit? That's it. And so I'm going to. So I turn up to all of these places, and this is not a clear-cut war. This just simply isn't a clear-cut war. You know, your basic problems is you have the ultimate bad guy. You have the ultimate bad guy. These guys are the fascists of the 21st century. There is no crime they have not committed. And on the other side, you've got a non-UN war. You don't know what peace looks like, and it could go either way. Any way from that. Now, I'm going to take some questions after this, but before I do, I'm just curious. Hands up for intervention. Hands up. Who thinks the New Zealand troops should be there?
100%.
Hands up for not being involved. Yep, that's pretty much what I've seen around the country. It's a 50-50 call for no matter where we go. Okay, so we're going to do some questions.
So we've got these two viewpoints of jumping right into the middle of everything or standing all the way back and seeing what happens either way. But what if we could have some way of being involved in more like ring fencing the situation, so rather than jumping into the middle, stand on the outside and contain it where it is?
This is a very strong argument that we should actually be involved in the humanitarian help. That we should, rather than sending our soldiers to train their soldiers, we should be doing more in terms of aid, in terms of civil infrastructure, and trying to sort of like build a better version of Iraq. That's a very powerful argument. But some people would argue the opposite thing is that even though the international machinery is broken, the moral responsibility to actually get involved in the fight is what we should do. That it shouldn't, I would suggest, it shouldn't be seen as an either or. I mean, one of the things I've been arguing about recently is that as much as we should, if we do get involved in the fight, then as a minimum, the first step we should do is take more refugees. But you shouldn't need to sort of like say one or the other. But the degree that we're involved in the fight is the absolute minimum. John Key could not have put a smaller contribution on the table compared to like what the other countries are doing right now. And so like the Australians have got like 900 troops over there. They've got aeroplanes over there as well. They're actively bombing. The big thing to watch right now with what our allies are going to be doing is that Canada is now on record for saying that they also want to get involved militarily against Syria. Australia hasn't. But now that Canada will join the war against Syria, it means that the war morphs between one enemy and another enemy. But the bigger area of concern is that there is a groundswell of opinion in the United States for boots on the ground. And so the Americans are now saying, we think we've got Islamic State on the run, let's get all of our soldiers in there. And if that becomes a policy, then you will find a lot more momentum on John Key's door and knocking more than for 142 soldiers. What was the question up the back?
My question would be about just, like, do you think the real ISIS is America itself? Like, do you think they are the one who are actually helping ISIS to fight the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people to reach their own targets in Iraq, like they did in Afghanistan? Like, I'm actually from Afghanistan. Like, when the Americans invaded Afghanistan, they actually helped the Afghan Mujahideen or the Afghan Taliban to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. So their goal was not to help Afghanistan people. Their goal was to take the Russian out of Afghanistan, which cost the life of 30 to 40,000 of Afghan people, and a lot of people from Afghanistan fled their house and fled their country to come to countries like New Zealand and Australia. Do you think that's the same thing that's happening in Iraq right now? So do you think that America is behind the ISIS thing to reach their own targets and goal in Iraq.
I-
And one other point that you said that John Key has deployed 140 soldiers in Iraq to train with the Iraqi soldier. John Key said the same thing to New Zealand people when he sent 140 soldiers in Afghanistan. And he said that the role of the army will be to train the Afghan army. I actually used to work for the New Zealand army in Afghanistan, and every day they were involved in fighting, killing, so they were not there to train the Afghan army, which you're saying that, that they are doing in Iraq.
Thank you. I would say it's a very big question. First of all, with the Iraqi army, I'll work backwards, there is a very big risk at the moment that the Iraqi army will behave without any recourse to restraint or the rules of war. And their reliance upon some of the Shia-based militia coming across from Iran is a great concern, because this will only spread the sectarian conflict. The point about America's involvement in this, I would suggest that the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was a UN authorised, mandated mission, and so I haven't got so many questions over the legality of that. The one in 2003 was clearly illegal with the invasion of Iraq. I have got issues with that. There's a difficulty in trying to disentangle at this point where fault begins, because we can say it was with regards to Iraq, at what point of history. We all got a favourite point that we go to, and in some ways we need to be cognizant of the history, because yes, there is fault and there is fingerprints over a lot of the mistakes in the past, but we've still got to deal with the present and what's happening now. But the one point I will draw out is with regard to Islamic State and terrorism in general, is that it works by trying to provoke us. Terrorism works on a lot of publicity and trying to draw an extremely strong response, because the stronger the response, the more likely that you'll have a reprisal, which is like a really heavy-handed action, and that will generate sympathy for the terrorist group. Islamic State wants that to happen. And so you can have a situation whereby Obama should, I would have argued, Obama should have got involved in Syria when Assad used chemical weapons on his own people. But the American Congress said, not our fight. And so here's Assad gassing his own people. But when Islamic State beheaded Stephen Foley on TV and killed one man, Islamic State made an enemy of 250 million Americans. And so that response, often if it's disproportionate, will end up creating the enemy that you want to defeat. The importance right now in fighting the enemy, and also in the way that we deal with the threat of terrorism at home, is we need to be more conscious of our human rights and our civil rights than ever before, because the more you stand on people's rights, the more the enemy you will create.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to ask you a question along the lines of religion being involved. Unlike Ukraine, we can see that this is a faith-based war, with a book of which both the Shia and the Sunnis believe a God is showing them the way, the truth. And it intrigues me as to how we can enter a war when we're identified with Christianity, particularly in America, where 75% of people believe in a God and a Christian belief. Therefore, if we join in a war, we will be seen by the whole of the Arab states to be morally using Christianity as a way of defeating their enemy. And I think this is going to turn things against us.
Without doubt, the Islamic State is making a great play upon religious identity, and it's trying to portray those very much against them, either as heretics, which are the Shia, as pagans, or as crusaders. I don't buy into this terminology. I think that if we get involved, and America gets involved, I don't see us getting involved as Christians. I see us getting involved as nation states in the 21st century, which should be largely sectarian, which are governed by rules of universal applicability. But having said that, you are correct that there is a large religious base to this conflict. And the larger base is not between Islam and Christianity. The larger basis of this conflict is between Shia and Sunni, or primarily between Iran and the other countries around it, particularly Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Qatar. There is a risk And there's a strong amount of provocation going on to try to turn this into a complete sectarian conflict. And at the moment, and this is one of the good reasons, a good reason to get involved is to try to keep them apart, or a mental reason to get involved to try to keep them apart. You can cut it both ways. Because one way or another, these two sides, and we've seen it, they are fighting by proxy. In Iraq and in Syria, you are getting the Shia-based on one side, or Shia-based aligned, and the broadly Sunni groups, and now also in Yemen to an even larger degree. You're seeing it again. And we're seeing the extremists, be it Al-Qaeda or be it Islamic State, doing remarkably evil things like blowing up each other's mosques, or just targeting people because of their religious identity. And so yes, you're right, there is a lot of religion in this.
I'll just stand so they can see me. No. Just 3 questions, if I may.
You may.
Short ones. One is, do you perhaps believe that countries that have a better human rights record when involved in war should, as a matter of fact, train these kind of armies in that kind of behavior? I've seen that happening in my own country, Colombia, and it's worked to an extent.
Yes.
That's question number 1.
The answer is yes. My view is that if our soldiers should carry our values in the sense that they should be there not only to further the military objectives, but also the social objectives as well. And so, particularly with regards to the Iraqi army, that means teaching them the importance of the rules of war and the importance of human rights. Because it's a different topic, but you can't make peace without human rights. You can't make peace when minorities are trodden on, or when people's rights are not respected.
Now, number 2. Is the divided opinion about whether you send soldiers or whether you send aid. And I say, why not send both? It would be like, I don't know, having someone who killed one of their children and only sending the social worker but not sending the police. So would you believe that that is a much better option, just actually committing to more than just war, and actually committing to war and a big humanitarian effort into building a better society?
That question's for the audience, you know, whether we should get more involved militarily or whether we should get less involved. But I would suggest we're only at the beginning of this, and there's a very good chance that this will yet escalate. That the question is how much we want to get stuck in the middle of it. And the arguments are both ways. I mean, like, you know, these guys are the perfect enemy. They are truly evil. But whether you want to get in front of them when there's no obvious exit point. But then we faced exactly the same argument in 1939 with the League of Nations didn't work and you had the rise of fascism. What do? Do you get involved or do you stay back?
Third question. And this could be just your personal opinion, but do you believe the New Zealand government perhaps did a conscientious effort to have all of these factors taken into account before making that commitment?
Could you rephrase the question, please?
Would you say, perhaps your opinion, that the New Zealand government took into account all the factors, perhaps to expand them even more to commit the troops?
No.
Your opinion?
No. I've had the luxury of working in the New Zealand government in various parts, and no. The thing that concerned me, there's a lot of things that concerned me with regards to the way that New Zealand went to war. And the biggest thing that concerned me most of all was when John Key announced that we were going as part of the club. Now, the difficulty of being part of the club was that the club he was talking about was the Five Eyes and the security network. I understand that. The problem is that the rules about the relationship with the club are secret. And so if we'd gone to war as part of our commitment under the ANZUS Treaty, where everything is forthright and you understand the principles and you know what you're fighting for, I'd say, okay, let's have the debate. But when you get dragged into a conflict on the basis of something which you can't actually see, and there's already serious questions about the way it behaves in a very clandestine way, then yes, I have question marks about that. And I felt that New Zealand's response, the minimal response, was not because of I don't think John Key listened to my lectures and said, Al, I'm going to go left or I'm going to go right. I think he got a phone call from his friends and said, I'm going to join the club.
Yep. Hello.
Hello.
Oh.
Hi, Al. Thank you very much for a very stimulating and balanced lecture.
I particularly like your analogy to the game where you hit down the thingies. I don't know that game, but I get the idea. The fact is, actually, since the so-called war on terror started, it's been a dismal success. We have far more terrorism now than we did then. So all of the measures undertaken by the US, the West, have failed dismally. We see a terrific increase. Would you agree with terrorism and the spread of terrorism and terrorist attacks?
If I can come back to that point, the answer is yes and no. The chance of a terrorist attack is now fourfold greater post-September the 11th than any other point. Yes. The only countries which are safer, ironically, are the United States. And so what's happened is, and even to a degree in the Western world, we're relatively safe, but the price of that has been our civil liberties.
Sure, I agree.
But outside of that, whether you're looking at Nigeria or Yemen or Libya, these other places are just breaking apart. And so the war on terror has created more terrorism.
Yes. Thank you, I agree. That was a preamble, actually. But what I want to say is that, you know, that's the centenary of Gillespie, and, you know, bearing that in mind, we must be even more careful about committing our young people, I have a son of that age, military age, to, you know, an ill-defined, as you say, and perhaps never-ending war. And bearing in mind that, you know, the US illegally invaded Iraq. I would dispute your numbers about the dead. The most recent study coming out from the International College of Physicians puts upward of 1 million Iraqis dead due to the American invasion, but I mean, it doesn't matter, we're talking hundreds of thousands or over 1 million. The point is, America invaded, and they created the conditions in which ISIS grew. Now, I'm not the person saying that. Patrick Coburn from The Independent, a lot of experts are saying that. So given that the US is responsible in large part for a lot of the mayhem we see in the Middle East, given the fact that they have a long and very ignoble record of intervening in foreign countries, regimes that are inconvenient, and even democratic regimes, and given that they're playing a double game in Syria, whereby they supposedly are fighting ISIS, but at the same time the US and its proxies are funding and training the war against Assad. That makes it much more problematic to join in and with that American effort, because we all know it's American-led. So, given those 3 points, isn't it incumbent on us to be even more vigilant in joining a war with those ill-defined and perhaps goals, and perhaps a never-ending war, a la the war on terror?
This, thanks, Bruce. I miss the Cold War. You know, I miss a conflict where there was good guys and bad guys, and I knew where I stood. And it was a very clear horizon of what we were meant to do. And today's world and today's war, and I imagine it's actually going to get worse, it's not going to get better in the foreseeable future, is murky, and it's difficult, and it's very hard to make a call. But I think, and you are correct, I think the 2003 invasion was illegal. There's no doubt about that. And I agree with you. I think the way that the American, not so much the invasion, but the reconstruction of Iraq has contributed to Islamic State and the rise of sectarian politics, I think that point is also true. Nonetheless, even though there is fingerprints of America and other countries over what happened, we still have a problem now that needs to be dealt with. But just because there was complicity in the past doesn't mean we shouldn't get involved now. But you're right. But you're right. We need to be aware of that. I'll let someone else go first, Bruce.
Okay, yeah, more or less just following on from that. Given the situation that we have no plan for whatever happens whenever the West invaded a country, seeing that all our military adventures have gone bad, considering that America may or quite likely is playing with smokes and mirrors and has more than one objective in the region, why are we letting this whole discussion be narrowed down to the situation of they are terrorists, are we intervening with military or not? Why can't we have a wider discussion to say, what are the, for example, economic implications of this conflict? Is there a chance of fighting ISIS and these terrorists by going for their economic base, where we have a much stronger leverage, for example, telling Turkey to close the border, telling our friends in Saudi Arabia not to support them? Why are we here in New Zealand and in other Western countries as well, just focusing on terrorists? Are we bombing or not? Why can't we have a wider discussion about the economic implications and working through our supposed allies in the region?
On the point about economics, the money that Islamic State is generating at the moment comes from primarily three sources. It came from hostages, but they've largely been killed off now. It came from the selling of antiquities, but what hasn't been looted has been destroyed. And it came also from the taxation base of the local community, and it came from oil as well, but they seem to have stopped a lot of the oil production. Having said all that, the greater problem is, correctly as you pointed out, is that the major source of a lot of Islamic State is coming through support from Qatar, it's coming from Turkey, and it's coming from Saudi Arabia. And so these three countries can turn on both the money and the supply of soldiers just like that. It really is that simple. And at the moment, their engagement against Islamic State is that big, officially. And that's a big concern, because this remains a war by proxy by these three, primarily these three countries, although there are others, against Iran, and to a degree on Syria as well with Assad. Yeah, it's huge. But people don't like to think about that. You know, so we think right now that Saudi Arabia is just fine and dandy by providing 6 planes to bomb the enemy. But at the same time, they're largely responsible, many would argue, because of some of their religion, some of their particular ideologies, and also their financial flows to the problem that we're seeing. Yeah, no, you're right. But you have to see that context. Otherwise, it will just come back again and again. Yeah.
Good evening. I just wanted to go to a point. You're talking about refugees, and that there was this huge refugee issue coming out of the wars in the Middle East. You're probably aware the European Union is now calling for a widespread open border intake after the tragedies we're seeing in the Mediterranean. I was just wondering, do you think there's any validity to the claims they're saying that ISIS and other terrorist organisations will use this open border policy they're allowing to almost sneak militants into these countries and then homegrown terrorism, or is that just a claim that might be being put out there to justify not taking in refugees or fighting them in the Middle East?
Big question, thank you. The refugee issue is bad and getting worse. It's also seasonal, so once the summer's over it should calm down a bit in Europe. But the European proposal is not having an open border, it's to collect them all effectively in one net, work out a comprehensive quota system which is increased from what they currently do, and then divide them up equitably amongst the countries. The problem is that the new Cameron government at least will say no to this. And the Europeans are beginning to feel a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of people trying to arrive on their shores. The bigger proposal of the Europeans at the moment is before the Security Council tomorrow, and that is to actually allow the bombing of criminal networks involved in the smuggling of refugees, which is kind of remarkable, you know, because I don't know how they're going to do that. But Libya is very nervous because all of a sudden now the target is not actually Islamic State, it could actually be a criminal group involved in people smuggling. So that's a different topic. But the more interesting topic is what makes a terrorist, and are they foreign people, are they first generation, are they second generation? A lot of work has been done on what makes people sympathetic to terrorism. The things that we know so far is that they tend to be in clusters, and so where you tend to find one terrorist person, you will find 2 or 3 sympathisers with them. They often tend to be isolated and a little bit withdrawn, which pretty much makes them any teenager that I know. And that they tend to be drawn to extreme views about right and wrong as well. There's no pattern in terms of ethnicity It has to do with exposure. Part of the problem now is that the exposure is over the internet, and so they can get their diatribes from anywhere. They're not, it's not related to, sometimes it's related to a particular mosque or a particular area, but more often than not, it's not. And they're individual. And the other thing with terrorism right now is that, again, you've got this division between Al-Qaeda, your gold standard, you kind of like your Jason Bourne, James Bond type characters, as opposed to Islamic State, which are guys who are going to run around with a knife or a car. And so to be a terrorist today, you don't need to be making a bomb to blow up a plane, you just need to be very angry and go to the kitchen.
Yes, hello. Okay. So first I wanted to thank you, or apologize for how this question and answer started out, and thank you for staying on stage and having a cohesive segment. My question is, has there ever been a more perfect enemy or a more fascist community that the UN refuses to define as a war?
No, the answer is no. Wayne mentioned it before. I've written a three-volume history on the laws of war. That these guys are unparalleled. Like you can't. The German. You imagine the fascists in World War II. They did the crimes. They absolutely did the crimes, but they tried to keep them secret. Islamic State does the crimes, and they stream them live over the internet. Often very similar crimes, and obviously the fascists at a much industrial scale. But they are without remorse, that they are unique. They are unique. To the point that Al-Qaeda is trying to tell them to calm down. And so when Al-Qaeda is telling you to calm down because you've got a problem, that things are out of control.
Yes, good evening. One of the points, well, there's 2 points here really. One is that while beheadings and all these things are very dreadful, I think we've got to be very careful not to get too emotional over these things and use that as some sort of criteria for going into a war. I'd like to know how many beheadings have actually taken place under ISIL. I prefer to call them ISIL because ISIS, the S, is actually supposed to be standing for the goddess of love. In Saudi Arabia, for example, last year they beheaded between 300 and 400 people. But we don't hear much about that, and they're supposed to be one of America's allies. The other thing is, too, that what makes a terrorist a terrorist? Quite frankly, I think it's because of interference with their state, their country. And when you get, for example, America sending in all these drones and these, what do you call it, signature strikes, where Obama just signs off an agreement to strike somebody on the supposition that he's a terrorist, and the drone fires a missile that not only kills the supposed terrorist, but also maybe a dozen or more innocent bystanders. That also flouts the law. There's 2 things here. One is that they've gone into a sovereign state, which is an act of war. The second point is that they've thrown out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the articles there that states that every person has the right to a fair trial, even though Bin Laden didn't get that. But I think that we've got to be a little bit more careful. For example, say for example, if China had a person in downtown New York, someone that they didn't want, how would the world respond if China was to send in a drone and with a missile and blow up part of New York? I think people would take a pretty dim view on that.
If I may, there's a lot of questions to unpack there. May I start?
Well, I'm just wondering, really, what is the sort of the real finite criteria here that defines whether or not we should become involved?
I'll start from the beginning. I agree. We need to have discussions about whether we should or should not go to war on a purely rational basis. Well, we should not let emotion cloud our decisions, because these are the most important decisions that citizens can make. On the point about the difference between what is a terrorist, and I'll run with your example for a little while about what with regards to drones, which is a different thing. The difference between, and I would argue that most of the drones are actually there legally, not illegally. The difference between a terrorist who kills a civilian and a drone which kills a civilian is one of intention. And so the terrorist intends to kill the civilian. The drone or the soldier does not intend to kill the civilian. And that very fine point is the distinction between the two. If I can come to a third aspect about the drones, is that one thing, we're all kind of pretty freaked out by drones at the moment, because we're starting to see them over our own neighbourhoods, and we're starting to see them proliferate in times of war. We're at the cusp of a military revolution in terms of technology. And there's just been a UN conference which ended 2 weeks ago on the new type of technology which, without any type of human intervention, effectively Robocop. And so we're within 2 decades of seeing fully autonomous military systems go into play. At the moment, when the drone flies over the top, the decision of whether to bomb or not bomb goes through someone's brain in Texas. In the future, that decision will not be there. It will be made by a computer. There's no regulation for that at the moment. And if you can put it together yourself very quickly, you can think about CCTV, you can think about a high-powered sniper's rifle, and you can think about facial identification. And you can work out very quickly the world you're going towards. That's it. Okay, I've been told we're going to get off stage. Thank you very much. We're going to keep chatting outside if you wish.
There's refreshments and drinks out by the bar there, and Al will be around for a short while if anyone wants to pin him up against the bar for a couple more questions. And since we've already thanked him, but I would just like to say thank you very much, Al, and obviously the question time has been filled, so therefore there's a lot of interest in your talk. So thank you, Al.